The cinema is not an art which films life. The cinema is something between art and life. Unlike painting and literature, the cinema both gives to life and takes from it. Literature and painting both exist as art from the very start. The cinema doesn't. Now, the medium of film will always stand as one of the greatest barometers of the state of society and a great place to look when searching for what permeates the public consciousness. Especially in the United States, where film has been a staple in shaping popular culture for over a century now. Whether it is cinema that reveals the cultural context or the cultural context that reveals the film is up for debate, but regardless, if you want to dive into what it is that defines and surrounds a year in the past century, look at the movies of that year. Look at the most lucrative films of the year, look at the most acclaimed films of the year, and look at the most controversial films of the year. Moreover, I'd also argue that the two genres that usually end up being the most saturated are also the best to look at. Horror and comedy have always been the easiest genres to profit off of. In both cases, the filmmakers have a clear end goal in mind, make the audience laugh or fear. And oftentimes, horror and comedy movies are the easiest to execute with a smaller budget, the former more so than the latter, as seen with films like 1968's Night of the Living Dead. Subsequently, there is a large audience for both genres, leading to room for a lot of profit. There's no wonder why 3 out of the 5 most profitable movies of all time in terms of budget compared to box office are horror films. And while horror in theory is the easiest genre to profit off of, it is also arguably the hardest to perfect. For a horror film to be successful, it is required for boundaries to be pushed in order to scare audiences in new ways and approach new and adapting societal fears. In the 1930s and 40s, popular horror films in the United States reflected the widespread fear of invasion in context to the US's isolationist foreign policies. So, many early films present singular monsters invading communal spaces, and this trend continued even as the United States transitioned into World War II. Post-World War II, you'll find a lot of horror movies tackling Cold War fears that extend the phobia of foreign intrusion. Movies like 1954's Them and 1963's The Birds now present large groups of invaders with a lot of nuclear war subtext. In the horror movies of this time, it is still very us versus them. As the 1960s roared on, the US entered Vietnam, the hippie movement rose, and more turmoil led to internal strife. The horror films of this era, such as 1968's Rosemary's Baby, start to present the horror from within. Societally, there was a growing mistrust in the government as the Vietnam War raged on. Moreover, films like 1974's Death Dream presented the horrors and fears that came as ramifications to the US's controversial involvement in the war. The 1970s saw this trend continue and in many ways exacerbate. Filmically, a lot has now changed. There's more of an emphasis on auteur filmmaking throughout this decade. Restrictions on violence, language, nudity, and gore being shown in film became much more relaxed, allowing for films like 1978's Halloween to be released. There are a lot of technological innovations in the film world, such as the introduction of the Steadicam in 1976 and Dolby Sound in 1971. To many critics, the medium of cinema, and in particular horror, seemed to have matured in the 1970s, becoming much more lucrative too. As aforementioned, horror must always push boundaries, and the 1970s saw a rise in atypical horror films, helmed by auteur filmmakers such as 1975's Jaws and 1973's The Exorcist. There is now also a rise in blockbuster filmmaking, Jaws widely being regarded as the first summer blockbuster. So overall, the film world actually thrived throughout the 1970s despite the rising tensions in the States. Heading into 1980, the year we'll be analyzing today, the nation continued to be defined by Cold War fears, new tensions in the Middle East, and a continuing mistrust in the government post-Watergate and the Vietnam War. The US was characterized by a crisis of confidence, economic stagnation, political mistrust, and a growing desire for cultural shifts. These conditions paved the way for Ronald Reagan's Morning in America campaign in the 1980 election, which promised optimism, economic revitalization, and a return to conservative values. Clearly, 1980 was a time where the vast majority of Americans wanted change, and they did just that by electing Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election, portraying a clear dissatisfaction with the economic and political state of the nation. Looking back at the box office returns from 1980, it's interesting to compare it to today. By and a far, the biggest film of the year was Star Wars Episode 5: The Empire Strikes Back, grossing over $200 million. This is similar to what we would see today. The most popular film of the year was a big event movie. However, of the next 5 highest grossing films, all of them can be categorized as a comedy, a phenomenon that we just do not see much of anymore. A lot of the comedies of this year, similar to many of the horror films we'll discuss, satirize the pervading socio-economic inequality, present an unfulfilled desire for social mobility, and the breakdown of typical familial structures. The Oscars for this year presented Robert De Niro the Best Actor award for his portrayal of Jake LaMotta in Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull, a film that exemplified the growing auteurism of the 1970s and can be read from the lens of the rising feminist movement at the time. From one toxically masculine character to another, the highest grossing horror film of 1980 is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and I will analyze its opening sequence as a case study to explore the filmic representations of the desire for change in the United States. Aside from The Shining, 1980's catalog of horror includes Friday the 13th, the second highest grossing horror film of the year. Following the success of films like Halloween and Black Christmas, Friday the 13th had a clear path for success paved for it. In general, it's a pretty campy and typical slasher film with some unique editing and kill scenes. It ends quite pessimistically, emphasizing the ideas of killers being deeply intertwined with familiar spaces in the past coming back to haunt us. John Carpenter's The Fog tells the story of vengeful ghosts from the past, whose return to a small coastal town symbolizes the haunting consequences of past wrongs. The Fog, a manifestation of guilt, reflects Carpenter's view that external horror comes from the outside, the other tribe. Internal is the human heart. In The Fog, the evil is both external and a reflection of the townspeople's collective guilt. Finally, Cannibal Holocaust and Altered States are both body horror films. With a lot of technological innovations in the cinema world, body horror became more popularized in the late 70s and blossomed throughout the 1980s. Many scholars argue that body horror conveys a clear sense of a society shorn to nothing by the profit nexus, a theme that critiques the rampant consumerism and growing economic greed of the era. Cannibal Holocaust, with its shocking portrayal of exploitation and violence, and Altered States with its exploration of the human psyche and the consequences of unchecked scientific experimentation, both critique the greed is good mentality that came to dominate the 1980s, particularly with the rise of a Wall Street culture. Similarly, The Shining explores how isolation amplifies internal struggles, turning Jack Torrance's psychological breakdown into a terrifying internal horror. Much like Cannibal Holocaust and Altered States, The Shining reflects the fears of the era, many of which rooted in external societal issues such as Jack Torrance's unemployment at the beginning of The Shining. All 3 films depict how the past, whether through societal decay, personal trauma, or supernatural forces, can intrude upon and destabilize the present. In Danse Macabre, Stephen King interprets the Amityville Horror, a film from the previous year, as a parable on American financial distress in the late 1970s, truly being a financial demolition derby beneath its ghost story exterior, highlighting anxieties over homeownership during the 1970s recession. The horror films of 1980 reflected the stylistic and thematic evolution that emerged from the 1970s wave of realism, cynicism, and auteur-driven storytelling. Directors like Stanley Kubrick and John Carpenter continued to push boundaries, crafting films that refused comforting closure and forcing audiences to confront unresolved horrors. A defining theme across these films is the cursed past, whether through the vengeful ghosts of The Fog, Jack Torrance's psychological breakdown in The Shining, or the return of a killer in Friday the 13th. This recurring motif of the past intruding upon the present symbolizes the anxieties of a society grappling with cultural and economic uncertainty. Additionally, these films embody the search for change, a desire rooted in the socio-political landscape of the time, while exposing the fears and instability that accompany such transformation. Filmmakers embrace techniques like stark realism, unsettling sound design, and innovative editing to amplify the tension, creating narratives that merged external horrors with internal struggles. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining employs a lot of filmic techniques, including tracking shots and the innovative use of the Steadicam to create a slow, foreboding atmosphere. These elements enhance the hotel's vast, isolating environment and intensify the psychological tension of the characters. The use of color, particularly sharp reds to offset the earthy tones of the set design, contribute to the film's eerie tone. POV shots and distorted sound further disorient the audience, reflecting the uncertainty of the characters' reality.
There are still images in The Shining that I wake up screaming about. That little boy in the hall and the
tracking of the Steadicam.
The little boy on the bicycle.
Of the little boy.
The sense of movement that gave that picture inside this very, very foreboding place.
Nicholson's portrayal of Jack Torrance keeps the audience at a distance with his erratic facial expressions, while Shelley Duvall's Wendy is marked by hesitation and fear, creating a constant sense of unease. This ambiguity in their performances underscores the film's theme of isolation, both physical and emotional, mirroring the breakdown of the American family unit. Set against the backdrop of rising unemployment and economic instability in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the film reflects societal anxieties. When we first meet Jack, he is at an interview. Jack's struggle to find work, his inability to do work, and his ensuing psychological unraveling parallel broader fears of economic collapse and the erosion of the American dream. In The Shining, isolation extends beyond the hotel's remote location to encompass the alienation brought on by the economic pressures, resulting in the disintegration of family bonds. Through this lens, a lot of Kubrick's The Shining can be seen as a critique of the cultural and economic instability of the time.
Jack is a school teacher. Formerly a school teacher.
What line of work are you in now?
I'm a writer. Teaching's been more or less a way of making ends meet.
Well, this ought to be quite a change for you.
Well, I'm looking for a change.
During the interview scene, Kubrick uses symmetrical framing to create a sense of order and control, which contrasts sharply with the underlying tension in the dialogue. The colorful set design, particularly the warm reds and oranges, draws attention to the discomfort beneath the surface of the conversation. Jack's statement about his teaching reveals the underlying financial strain and dissatisfaction with his career, reflecting the film's broader themes of personal and societal decline. This scene is filled with preconceived idiosyncrasies, such as Jack's forced smile and the rigidity of his posture, which highlights his instability to fully align with traditional roles of success or stability. The careful composition of the shot, combined with these subtle idiosyncrasies, emphasizes the dissonance between Jack's external appearance and internal turmoil, suggesting a deeper unraveling yet to come. Horror is not a genre meant to scare, it's a genre meant to confront. It holds up a mirror to society's deepest fears and their darkest truths. The horror films of 1980 reflect a society teetering on the edge of transformation, capturing both the yearning for change and the deep-seated fears that come with it. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining stands as the year's defining example, a chilling exploration of isolation and mental decline that mirrors the anxieties of a nation grappling with economic instability, cultural disillusionment, and a desire for something new. Jack Torrance's descent into madness, fueled by his alienation, professional failure, and inability to escape the oppressive weight of the past, embodies the very real fears of a crumbling American dream. His unraveling represents not just a personal collapse, but a larger societal reflection, where the desire for stability collides with the uncomfortable reality of change. The fears of 1980 take multiple forms: the return of past trauma, the consequences of societal guilt, and the intrusion of the abnormal into familiar spaces. Whether it is ghosts emerging from the fog or killers lurking in the woods, these films depict a society haunted by its unresolved history while uncertain of what is going to lie ahead. The filmmakers of this year capture a moment when Americans sought change but feared its consequences, what it might demand, destroy, or reveal. The election of Ronald Reagan symbolized hope for renewal, yet beneath this optimism lurked a lot of skepticism. For many, change was both a necessity and a threat, a double-edged sword reflecting the growing divide between an idealized future and an uncomfortable present. And in many ways, 1980 is very reminiscent of 2024, a pivotal election year where clearly the masses desired change. Ultimately, horror often thrives in times of upheaval because it confronts the very fears society struggles to articulate: fear of losing control, fear of confronting the past, and fear of an unknown future. Through Jack Torrance's madness, vengeful ghosts, and collapsing family units, the films of 1980 remind us that change is rarely comfortable but is often inevitable, and by looking at the horror films that defined such a pivotal year in US history, maybe we can learn a thing or two heading into the future.